everybody, welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, True Aussie Murders Caffeinated. I'm your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome to episode 9, guys. Today's episode is titled Stolen for Money, the Murder of Graeme Thorne. Now, first off, I will say straight off the bat that this episode covers the abduction and a murder of a child, and it is distressing. And if that's not your thing, if this is not what you want to listen to, that is fine. You can turn me off. You can not listen. That is A-okay. But I just wanted to give you a warning, because if that is something that upsets you, today's podcast is not for you. But if you are staying with me, thank you. And I need to quickly cite my sources before we go on. So my sources for today's episode is the sydneymorningherald.com.au, trove.nla.gov.au, heraldsun.com.au, adb.anu.edu.au, Wikipedia, and again the Herald Sun. Now I need to say, if you hear little pitter-pattering in the background, I just have my two dogs in my studio / spooky room with me as I'm recording tonight. So if you do hear little noises in the background, it's just them joining me and getting comfy, because it's nighttime and they're settling in for the evening. And again, we go straight to what am I drinking while I'm talking to you lovely people today. So today I have managed to get my hands on some various forms of coffee syrup. So I'm drinking a black coffee with cinnamon swirl syrup, and it's the cinnamon swirl is quite, sorry, my dog's trying to talk to me. The cinnamon swirl is quite spicy, if that's the word I want to use. It has a bit of bite to it. It's an acquired taste, but it's not bad. So whatever you guys are drinking, get yourself settled, get yourself comfy, lend me your ears, and I will tell you the tale of the boy who was stolen for money, the murder of Graeme Thorne. And it is an upsetting story. It really is. Even researching this one made me upset, but it is important and his story needs to be heard, so we are going to talk about it. So if you haven't got yourself a drink, guys, if you're not settled, do that. Put me on pause and then come back to me, and we'll get started right at the very beginning, because that's what I do. Okay, so welcome back, guys. Let's get started. So winning lotto is something we all dream of, right? And I know I'm guilty of fantasizing about what I would do if I won the big one. I mean, I think we all do, don't we? We'd quit our jobs, we'd travel, and we'd live a life of leisure. And I dare say, you know, most of us share that dream, that we would just chuck it all in and leave it all behind. But for so many of us, that is all it will be, a dream. But for Sydney couple Bazil and Freda Thorne, their dream lotto win turned into a living nightmare that ended up in the kidnap and murder of their beautiful 8-year-old son Graeme, and would bring a new evil and unheard of fear to Australia's shores, and change the way we looked at stranger danger forever. But of course, before we get to the nitty-gritty, we have to get to the very beginning, and that's what we're going to do right now. So today's episode takes us to the city of Bondi, New South Wales, Australia. So Bondi, I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Bondi is world famous for its beautiful beaches, picture perfect scenery, and beautiful people. And in July 1960, where today's episode takes place, this was no different. Sydney City was buzzing. It was the dawn of a new decade and things were happening. And the main and most exciting thing being the Sydney Opera House was being built. But unfortunately, things were not going to plan. The build was weeks behind schedule, and as with most builds, costs had blown way out and the government couldn't afford it. So they had to think fast, and they had to think of an easy way to come up with the money to get this icon built and open to the public. And the best way to do that was run a lottery offering a handsome cash prize for the winner, and it was a success. Sydney siders bought tickets each week to see if they could hit the jackpot, and one week Bazil and Freda Thorne were amongst them when their numbers came up on the 1st of June 1960, and they won. They won £100,000, which is around $3 million today. So, life changing amount of money. Bazil and Freda were hardworking, honest Aussies, just making ends meet. They had just started renting the bottom floor of a duplex at 79 Edward Street, Bondi, and the dream of home ownership was just that. Like, for so many Australians, a dream. It was just a dream until they won the lotto. Now, Basil Harold Parker Thorne was born on the 7th of October 1922. He was a hardworking and friendly guy, and he met his wife Freda, who was born on the 11th of November 1925 during World War II, when he was stationed at the Japanese prisoner of war camp in Cowra, New South Wales. Cowra is a small town in the central west region of New South Wales. Freda and Bazil married and settled in Sydney soon after they had met, and Bazil joined his dad working as a commercial traveller, which consisted of him selling clothing and other goods to large country stores. The job was hard, and it meant that Bazil had to travel a lot and carry heavy samples around on his travels in the hopes of making a sale. The job of a commercial traveller was once a well-paying one, but not by the late 50s, early 60s, where modern luxuries had finally caught up with Australians who were tightening their belts, and as a result, Bazil's wage was barely enough for his family to scrape by on. The couple also had another burden, I guess, for want of a better word, but they had a daughter, Cheryl, who had been born with a handicap so severe she needed round-the-clock care, which of course cost money. The Thornes made the heartbreaking decision to place her in an institution that could care for her in northern Sydney. And they went on to have two other children, Belinda, who was born in 1951, excellent name, and Graeme, who was born in 1957, but they always acknowledged their firstborn, Cheryl, which was rare for the time, because other families in the exact same situation never did. But the Thornes did. They acknowledged her and still loved and cared for her deeply. Now, the Thornes were your typical Australian family who, like so many others, struggled to make ends meet with their lives, but they were happy with their lot, and they were happy, friendly people. And when Bazil won first prize in that lottery, when he won that cool £100,000, as was standard at the time, their names and faces were splashed on the front page of every newspaper, often accompanied with a picture of Bazil beaming while holding his winning lottery ticket. And it was also publicised that the Thornes would receive their money, their winnings of £100,000, on the 7th of July. Now, while the majority of those around them were happy for the Thornes and their good fortune, one man was not. Now, his name was Stephen Bradley, and he was beyond jealous of the family who had won the money that he so desperately needed, and in his opinion deserved more than they did. Now, Stephen was a classic victim, and he was certain that Bazil and Freda didn't have the horrible life the Hungarian immigrant had, so they did not deserve that money. Now, Stephen was born Istvan Baranya, and I hope I've said that correctly. Please let me know if I haven't. And he did. He had a horrible life. He did. He had a horrible life filled with trauma. There was no denying that. He lived through Nazi occupation of his home country, Hungary. And then when that was over, he had to live with the political unrest and poverty that followed. So, wanting better for himself, he migrated to Australia, where he was met sadly with racism, being left out because he wasn't like them, and awkwardness as he settled into his new home. So absolutely, he had some trauma, definitely. Now, to feel more like he blended in with the Australians who he was so desperate to be friends with, he changed his name to the very safe and unmemorable name of Stephen Bradley. Now, at this point, Stephen was onto his third wife, and between them they had 3 children. And while he seemed like a good husband and loving father to his stepchildren, he also liked to keep up appearances, and as a result, Stephen had gotten the family into quite a bit of debt. Now, desperate to make big money fast, and bitter at the Thornes for their good fortune that he was certain was rightfully meant to be for him, Stephen came up with a plan to kidnap the couple's only son, 8-year-old Graeme, and hold him for ransom. Now, Stephen found the Thornes' address, which wasn't hard because it was published when the news of their lotto win broke. And he took himself to the park near the house and, a few mornings observed their morning routine. He watched young Graeme leave the house in his school uniform and be picked up by a lady in a car. There were 2 young boys in the car with her. Stephen then observed Freda leave the house with young Belinda and head to the shops. Now, the lady who was picking up Graeme, Mrs. Smith, was a friend of Freda's and had been dropping Graeme and her boys off to Scott's College in Bellevue Hill, the school they attended regularly. Now, Stephen planned to kidnap the young boy and hold him for ransom, but he also needed the family's phone number so he could call them demanding that ransom. And to do this, to make sure he had the correct phone number, which again had been publicised, he paid them a visit one night pretending to be looking for a previous tenant and pretending it was a, quote, husband and wife matter. Now, Freda answered the door, and when she replied that she knew of no such man, Stephen asked if the phone number he had on him was their phone number or the man he was looking for, and he recited the phone number to Freda, who stated, yes, that is our phone number. She also replied, how did you get that number? Before telling Stephen that the number hadn't even been connected yet. Stephen smiled at her and told her, don't worry, husband and wife matter. And he always had a way of finding information out. Stephen left Freda unknowingly confirming the info that he needed, and he set his plan into action. On Thursday the 7th of July, Stephen woke up before his family, grabbed a picnic rug from the boot of the family car and put it in the back seat. He drove to the corner where he knew Graeme would be picked up for school, like he was every morning, and waited. At around 8:30 that morning, Graeme was walking to the spot where he always got picked up, and he had planned to go to the corner shop right nearby and buy a packet of chips. He was dressed in his school uniform and cap and was carrying his school bag, which contained his lunchbox and school books. And as soon as Stephen saw Graeme approaching, he opened his door and asked the young boy to cross the street and talk to him for a minute. When Graeme approached the car, Stephen was now standing by the open passenger door and said, quote, you must be Graeme. I've been sent to pick you up to take you to Scott's because the lady who normally picks you up is sick. Her 2 boys are already at school and I've been asked to pick you up and another boy. Your mother Freda has been told, so you better get into the car and then we'll pick up the other boy and drop you off at school, end quote. Now, stranger danger wasn't a thing back then. You have to remember it was the early 60s. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't even a thought. So at that time, Graeme had no reason to think this man wasn't telling him anything other than the truth, and he wasn't anyone other than a man that his mother had sent to collect him. I mean, he said his mother's name after all. How could he not know that if how could he know that if he was lying? So, Graeme hopped in the car with the man and off they drove. They drove away from Bondi and towards another suburb in Sydney called Woollahra, where Centennial Park is located. And Centennial Park is a huge park located in Sydney that people use for picnics, etc., on weekends. And that was an activity that Graeme and his family had enjoyed on many occasions. And as Stephen drove through the gate of the park, he told Graeme, quote, We're picking the other boy up here. He lives just on the other side of the park and his mother is bringing him. This is the quickest way to go. He should be here in just a minute." And he pulled over on the side of the road. With that, he lunged at Graeme, wrapping his hands around his neck and pulling him onto his lap and between his stomach and the steering wheel. He then shoved a rag soaked in some kind of chemical over the young boy's mouth and nose, causing Graeme to lose consciousness almost instantly. Stephen then laid him on the front seat next to him and covered him with the picnic rug that he had put in the back seat earlier. He then quickly got Graeme out of the car, still wrapped in the picnic rug, and put him in the boot of his car. He tied his hands and feet together with rope and put a scarf around his mouth, gagging him. In the event that the young boy woke up and screamed out for help, this would stop him being able to make any noise. Not a single person, not a single soul saw this take place. Stephen then drove with Graeme in the boot to Spit Bridge, where he got out and went to a public phone booth and made the phone call that would change Freda and Bazil's lives forever. Meanwhile, speaking of Freda was frantic. Her friend that had always picked Graeme up, Mrs. Smith, told her he wasn't in his usual spot and nor was he at school. Freda was, as any mother would be, she was absolutely beside herself. She called the police to report her boy missing, and Sergeant O'Shea paid her a visit. Just as he walked through the door at around 9:30 a.m, the phone rang. Freda answered it, and the male voice with the accent on the other end asked to speak to her husband. When she asked what he wanted to speak to her husband for, he replied, quote, "I have your son." Sergeant O'Shea took the phone from Freda and pretended to be her husband, asking the man what he wanted. The man replied, "I have got your boy. I want £25,000 before 5 o'clock this afternoon." Now, Sergeant O'Shea was in the dark about the Thornes' lotto win. He didn't know they'd come into a large amount of money. Freda hadn't told him yet. She didn't even have a chance really to talk to him before the phone rang, and he didn't see it in the newspaper, because with that demand from the kidnapper, he replied with, "How am I going to get money like that?" To which the caller, the kidnapper replied, "You have plenty of time. I'm not fooling. If I don't get the money, I'll feed him to the sharks." It was then that Sergeant O'Shea, realised Graeme had been kidnapped. The first time anything like this had occurred in Sydney, in Australia even, and the police did not even know where to begin. Now, after making that first ransom call, Stephen returned to his house with Graeme still in the boot of his car. Stephen quickly checked on the condition of his kidnapped victim and tightened the rope around his hands and ankles. And when Graeme started making some noise, when he started to stir, he just slapped another chemical-soaked rag in his face until he stopped squirming. He left him in the boot and went into his house and got on with his day. When he went to check on him again at around 3 p.m, he discovered that Graeme was dead. Now, undeterred, unbothered, he carried on with his plan and called the Thorne home at around 9:47 p.m, where another police officer answered the phone pretending to be Bazil Thorne. He stalled the caller so they could run a trace, and the caller told them to put the ransom in 2 paper bags before hanging up. Now, as news hit the press of this kidnapping, as it went far and wide, it was front page news. And plenty of false sightings were coming in hot and strong, with none of them actually leading to the whereabouts of Graeme or Stephen. And when Graeme's school cap and bag was found on July 11, a reward of £5,000 was offered to anyone who could help the police with any information, and this really sent false reports through the roof, but none of them led to the recovery of Graeme. Meanwhile, police were following up every single lead they had to, and Few people had reported seeing a man numerous times in the park opposite the Thorne household just lingering. And on the morning of the kidnapping, witnesses reported seeing a blue 1955 Ford Custom Line double parked near where Graham's waiting spot, the spot that he was always picked up from. Now, police combed through more than 5,000 registrations that matched the general description of that car and called in every owner who was in the area. And remarkably, Stephen Bradley was one, and he was called in and interviewed, but he denied being anywhere near Bondi the day Graeme went missing. Now, sadly, on Tuesday the 16th of August, nearly 6 weeks after he had been kidnapped and roughly 1.5 kilometres from where his school bag and cap was found, Graham's little body was found under a rock's ledge on a vacant block of land in Grandview Grove, Seaforth, which is a suburb not too far from Bondi. He was still in his school uniform. Both his hands and feet were still tied up. Still gagged by the same scarf, and was wrapped in the blue tartan blanket that Stephen had wrapped him in. Now, the boys who found him had seen this blanket off in the distance for a while as they played on the vacant lot often, but didn't think to mention it to their parents until they finally did at about 7 p.m. that day. And of course, parents made the discovery and called the police. Now, Bazil Thorne had the absolutely heartbreaking task of identifying his only son at the city morgue. And the kidnapping case changed very quickly into a hunt for the person who killed Graeme. Now, the blanket Graeme was wrapped in was sent away for analysis. Now, remember, it was 1960. There was no DNA then, but they did an absolutely remarkable job considering what little they had at their disposal to help, identify anything DNA like that. And I'll go on to explain why. So the blanket Graeme was wrapped in was sent away for analysis, and it showed to be a blanket number 0639 of 3000 made, and it had been manufactured in South Australia between June 1955 and January 1956. Police tracked the sale to a friend of the Bradleys who had given the blanket to Stephen's wife as a gift. On the blanket, police also found traces of 2 different types of trees that were not on the block of land where Graeme was found, along with hair from a Pekingese dog and human blonde hair. Soil was also found on the blanket, and along with fragments of pink limestock mortar. Now, Graeme had cuts and abrasions on his body, and it wasn't clear if he died from either asphyxiation, the skull fracture that he had received, or a combination of both. Post-mortem also showed that he had died within 24 hours of being kidnapped. Now, police searched for a house that had the blue car, the pink limestock mortar, and the 2 specific types of trees that had been found on the blanket in their yard. And though one of the trees, which was a cypress tree, was common, a combination of 2 on the same property was rare. And following a tip-off from a postman, a very observant postman, a house with both was identified, and that house was 28 Moore Street, Clontarf, around 1.5 kilometres from where Graeme's body had been found. Police stopped by the house on the 3rd of October and learned that a Hungarian immigrant by the name of Stephen Bradley had lived there, and they had a pet Pekingese dog, and his wife had blonde hair. They also, unbelievably, found a roll of undeveloped film, and when they had that film developed, it revealed a photo of the family on a picnic rug, the exact same picnic rug that Graeme had been wrapped in, with a Pekingese dog on it and a bleached blonde-haired wife. Now, the police were absolutely certain they had their man, but they had one great big obstacle. Stephen and his wife had moved out of that home and had moved to a nearby suburb called Manly and resided there for a few weeks before departing Australia for London aboard the SS Himalaya. if Stephen thought he had gotten away with murder, he had another thing coming, because when that boat docked at Colombo, Ceylon on Monday the 10th of October, two Sydney policemen, Sergeants Brian Doyle and Jack Bateman, were waiting for him, and he was promptly arrested. Now, I just want to say there was never, ever, ever any thought that Stephen's wife was involved in this at all. So she's got absolutely nothing to do with this. But after 5 weeks of waiting for the legal, back and forth to get him extradited back to Australia, he was. And he arrived back in Australia on the 18th of November, where he allegedly made a confession to the kidnap and murder of 8-year-old Graeme Thorne. He even went as far to sign a confession, which part of it, in his own words, state, quote, "I went out and I watched the Thorne boy leaving the house and seen him for about 3 mornings, and I had seen where he went. And one morning I have followed him to the school at Bellevue Hill. 1 or 2 mornings I have seen a woman pick him up and take him to the school. On the day we moved from Clontarf, I went out to Edward Street. I parked the car in a street. I don't know the name of the street. It is off Wellington Street. I have got from the car and I waited on the corner until the boy walked down to the car." End quote. The trial started on the 20th of March 1961 at Central Court in Sydney to an absolutely packed public gallery. Now, people were scrambling to witness this trial every single day, and the main observers, the main witnesses, I guess, in the public gallery were women. Now, Stephen Bradley pled not guilty to murder. Now, Stephen's past was examined and his history laid bare for all to hear. His rough childhood, having survived World War II, having arrived as an immigrant divorcee in Australia in 1950, losing his second wife to a car accident, remarrying for a 3rd time, and feeling the pressure to provide for his new family, which had him working several jobs at one point. But if, Stephen's tragic story was, being told in the hopes of getting sympathy, they were preaching to the wrong choir. At one point, Freda Thorne was called to the witness stand, and she had ID'd Stephen immediately in a photo lineup. Remember, he'd come to the house with his fake, "I'm looking for someone, this is a husband and wife matter" story just before Graeme was kidnapped. His swami look and his accent made him very hard to forget. And after enduring tough questioning by Stephen's defence in the witness box, she sobbed, quote, "I don't care what you say, this is the man who killed my boy." Now, this drew, gasps and tears and sobbing from the women in the public gallery, as they no doubt sympathised with the grieving mother and wanted to support her. And to Freda's credit, she refused to make eye contact with her son's killer, absolutely refused to acknowledge him. He just sat there all impassively. She gave a strong testimony that Stephen was the man who knocked on her door looking for another man, and then asked her to recite her phone number back to him. She remembered his face and his accent, and she was an incredible witness. At one point, defense tried to say that the dog hairs that were found on the picnic blanket that Graeme was wrapped up in belonged to the dog of the tenant who lived upstairs from the Thornes, because they lived on the bottom and another tenant lived upstairs, but Freda was having none of it. And prosecution didn't buy Stephen's versions of events either, especially the story that when he kidnapped Graeme, the child apparently sat along beside him quietly while he drove him away. And Stephen, did confess to the kidnap of Graeme, driven by greed and jealousy, but he stated he didn't intend to kill the boy. He was dead when he left him in the trunk, so he had no choice but to dump his school bag and cap nearby, and then dump his body on an empty block of land. A block of land that coincidentally Stephen had looked at buying not long before. Prosecution put it to the court that there is no way Graeme would have just sat in that car while Bradley drove around Sydney looking for a phone booth to make the ransom phone call to his parents, and then drove him back to Centennial Park. He just would not have sat there. He would have said something. He would have screamed. They also stated that Graeme had been taken back to Stephen's house at one point and had possibly been murdered there. A doctor testified that Graeme would have died a violent death and that the fracture in his skull, which was in the thickest part of his skull, would have taken considerable force to fracture. Now, Stephen Bradley never showed any compassion or sympathy to the family whose lives he destroyed. He only cared for himself and he maintained his innocence. The trial lasted for 9 days before Stephen Bradley was found guilty by an all-male jury and sentenced to life in jail. But sometimes fate has a way of stepping in and sorting things out so we don't have to. He died in jail from a heart attack at the age of 42 on October 6, 1968. Now, Bazil and Freda were never recovered from the brutal and senseless murder of their beloved boy, and Bazil died in 1978, aged 56, and Freda passed away in 2012, aged 86. Freda was laid to rest next to Graeme in the Macquarie Park Cemetery, Ryde, New South Wales. If there is a heaven and if there is an afterlife, and I always believe there is, I can only hope that both Bazil and Freda had the most wonderful reunion with their boy when they finally got to see him again. Now, this horrible, horrible case changed the way Australia looked at itself and its "she'll be right, that doesn't happen here" attitude towards kidnappings and stranger danger. We'd never even thought about that stuff before. It wasn't even on our radar. We never had to worry about it. But now it was. A new evil had landed on our shores and we had to deal with it. And if it happened once, it could happen again. So people were more aware of stranger danger and the message was drummed into kids far and wide. Now, I'm a child of the 80s. Don't want to give away my age, but I remember stranger danger being hammered into our heads as kids. Don't hop in cars with strangers. Don't, accept lollies. Don't accept this. Even if they tell you mum and dad sent you, no, do not do it. Even if they know their names, no. So, the message was drummed right into kids far and wide, and a new fear had been realised and we had to be on alert. It also changed how lotto winners, ones who had won massive jackpots or even small jackpots, were announced. They weren't. They weren't ID'd and they were allowed to remain anonymous. They could say someone in Sydney won $500,000, but that is it. No identifying features at all. So they could go on and enjoy their win without having to worry about if a ransom call was heading their way. And that changed after Graeme Thorne died, and it is something that Australia still practices today. So I guess if anything positive could come out of this, it is, countless children have possibly been saved from horrible situations because of the awareness raised around stranger danger, and people who have won, a bit of money can enjoy their privacy and, plan their holidays and buy their houses in peace without worrying about a loved one being kidnapped and held for ransom. So there we have it, guys. That is the horrible, heartbreaking tale of Graeme Thorne, the young boy who was murdered for money. And, every story I've spoken about, every murder I've spoken about, really, it really does get me. But this one just really gets to me as well. It really got to me researching it. It's just so senseless. It's so unnecessary. And I don't even know how the Thornes could have gotten on with their life after having experienced such a horrific and heartbreaking and life-changing event. So there we have it, guys. Thank you. Thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it. And if you are enjoying my podcast, please share the word. I would love for you guys to share the word if you feel so inclined. And you can also welcome to comment. You can comment now. You can rate the podcast. Any feedback is good feedback. So I would love to hear from you guys or see some stars pop up if you also feel so inclined. And as always, guys, thank you again for listening. You are all absolute rock stars. And until next time, stay safe, stay cool, and stay caffeinated. I will catch you all later.